Hi, Ruani.
Hello.
Everyone,
Hello.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Happy New Year.
Hello, everyone. Good. Happy New Year. We'll start in a couple of minutes. We're just waiting for a few more participants. I'm designated as the host for this afternoon's talk, which is organized by the Faculty Development Committee chaired by Dr. Mark Brook. I hope everybody can hear me. Thanks. Xin chào Vietnam. I think we can start in a minute. I hope everyone have had a great Chinese New Year celebration, Lunar New Year celebration. Welcome to the first of a series of talks organized by the Center for English Language Communication. I think I'm seeing participants from all over the world, from Vietnam, from the Philippines, from the UK, of course, from Singapore, and I think a lot more will be joining us soon. So we are privileged to have with us this afternoon a member of the CLC family. I think I can introduce him now. So our guest lecturer this afternoon is no stranger to CLC. In fact, he was with the center for a good 10 years or more before moving to the National Institute of Education in 2013. Currently, he is a lecturer of social linguistics in education at the Department of Communication, Culture, and Media at the Institute of Education, University College London. Needless to say, the world's leading institute of education. He's also the program leader of MA in Service TESOL and senior fellow of the UK Higher Education Academy. He is associate editor of the International Journal of the Sociology of Language and sits in several international advisory and review boards such as Language Policy, Language and Education, and the Asia Pacific Education Researcher. In May 2022, he was one of our featured speakers in the 6th CLC Symposium held online. And now we would like to virtually welcome him back. Colleagues, please welcome Dr. Ruani Tupas.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. It's nice to see very familiar faces, and at the same time also new faces. It's really great to be back, and I'm definitely excited to to engage in more conversations with everybody in the next few minutes. We were, if I asked Jean, well, thank you very much, Jean, as well for the warm welcome, and also Mark and your team for the invitation. Um, if it will be Jean helping me with the slides. Most of you probably don't know, we sorted out all the technological issues just a minute before you came in. um, I think our system is down. I couldn't get to Outlook, and I have a feeling that that's also an issue with some Outlook, platforms in other parts of the world as well. But anyway, at least I'm here and I'm able to talk and make and present on the topic that actually was suggested by Mark and his team, and of course something that I'm excited about, because this is something that's very much close to my heart as well. So, of course, when we talk about the title, the importance of different Englishes in the higher education classroom, um, the it's not, in a sense it is. I'm conflicted in the way I would like to approach this particular title because of the word importance, because um, but I think it's necessary to start off with this, precisely because whether or not we actually think of different Englishes as important, they are there, they exist, they're around, right? So I guess it's something that you know repeatedly in the next few slides I should be able to argue that social linguistically speaking, these are part and parcel of who we are as speakers of English, as teachers of English, as students of English as well. And so when you talk about importance, it's really more about how do we frame and our understanding of these different Englishes, which are everywhere, which are in the university and outside the university as well. All right, so there are, thanks, Jean, yes, please. So there are four parts of the talk. The first one, of course, I will talk first, introduce to broadly some dimensions of different Englishes. These will not be exhaustive in the sense that, of course, these we all talk about structural linguistic dimensions of different Englishes, but I'd want to start off by by dispelling that particular notion, because when you're talking about Englishes, the phenomenon of pluralization and localization of Englishes, it's far more than actually just the structure and linguistic dimensions. And so when I talk about these dimensions and these different spaces within which we can actually also engage in sort of research, um, I will not be exhaustive, but just simply highlight some of these um, you know, certain aspects of Englishes that I think need to be put forward. Englishes, and then I move on to something that actually brings me back to my time at the CLC some years ago. I did some kind of a research which has been published, and also I think I gave a presentation on this. I don't have the a copy of the article, but it's fortunately for me, I saw some screenshots of this article somewhere in my PowerPoint slides. I was able to put them in and incorporate them here. So basically, the idea is just simply for me to just talk about a specific aspect of of Englishes, but here in the context of culture in the classroom as well. And then I move on to the third part, which is, in a sense, I call them stories of Englishes, because these are ways of understanding how Englishes actually came about. Of course, I talk about how they are conceptualized in different ways as well, in different but related ways as well. And then lastly, um, the ways forward. In other words, that number four, Gene, that ways forward. I'll definitely be putting in a few concepts here and there, more some theoretical, some practical, that will help us, probably engage with different Englishes in particular ways in our respective classrooms as well. So the first part will be dimensions of different Englishes. And as what I said, this aspect I hope is to dispel in a sense. Okay, so not just dispel, but basically to broaden, the scope of how we actually view different Englishes, right? So can you move on to the next one, please? So for example, um, the lexical dimension of world Englishes. I mean, some of these, a lot of work has been done on this in this area, on lexical innovation, for example, how words, because of language contact, have somehow been transformed in particular ways, not semantically, but also structurally as well. Next, please. But something that is also kind of in a sense glossed over in the study of world Englishes, but actually also is really bubbling up in terms of interest, um, is the context of listening. All right. I think when we talk about world Englishes, we talk simply of what's explicitly available, what's explicitly observable. All right. But I think we can also talk in terms of, for example, listening as manifestations and as operationalization of this whole idea of English is, because when we listen in different ways. We are, our ears are attuned to the different kinds of sounds, to the different kinds of accents, for example, and we take up meaning based on how we listen, right? And in other words, we may have all, the same ears, physiologically speaking, but we listen differently, right? And we listen differently precisely because we have been socialized into environments that are different from one another. And when we listen therefore based on what we have been told, or what we have actually been, in a sense, what we have been socialized into. In other words, we listen to what we think is worth listening to. We don't listen to things that are not worth listening to, and this is something very, very important, because when we talk about, let's say, comprehension and comprehensibility, um, we may all listen to the same sounds, all right, but some may comprehend certain things in different ways, not precisely not only because the sounds that they listen to are not clear, but precisely because these sounds are associated with certain other characters and identities of people. All right. So listening is something that's far more, I think, how do you call this? Far more complex, than just simply hearing sounds and words and so on and so forth. And here, I think, when we get to, let's say, the issue or the question of different Englishes, then those who do well in listening to different varieties, being able to switch between different Englishes, for example, are able to engage in conversations a lot more comfortably and a lot more competently as well. Next, please. This is also something that's important to in the world Englishes paradigm and world Englishes research, how Englishes, the different Englishes, actually are very much embedded in intercultural communication. And I think one of the things that when we listen to conversations about and on different Englishes or world Englishes, if we call it that, all right, it is unfortunate that usually discussions, especially in the context of pedagogy, our discussions are very much limited to very, in a sense, um, iconic, supposed iconic representations of different Englishes. Should it be cope up with or cope with? Should it be a result in or result to? So, in a sense, the kinds of debates become pedagogical debates, especially, are reduced to this kinds of this small number of phrases and idioms. All right, when in fact, when we're talking about Englishes, it's far more than just simply these idioms, and therefore something that we need to look into as well. So, what I mean by that is, when we're talking about Englishes, they don't operate in isolation. They cannot be deemed decontextualized. They always appear in certain spaces of conversations. They always appear in certain spaces of, articulation, for example. So, word English is in writing, in writing, for example, or English is in intercultural communication. You don't have Englishes for their own sake, or on, they usually occur in, context, in other words. And I think what Sharifan and Sadegpur basically are putting forward here is that the realization of Englishes in global, international, intercultural, in communication, really is in people engage in intercultural interactions. All right. And because of that, because of the kinds of intercultural differences that people usually bring into the conversation, then these constitute parts of what we may call Englishes. Next, please. Um, this also contrast, another dimension, of course, is in contrastive rhetoric, right, in world Englishes. Um, I think we all know that, the world has actually many different rhetorical conventions and rhetorical traditions. All right, there is no one rhetorical tradition or that we all subscribe to, except of course that there are certain ways of writing, certain ways of speaking that are more privileged, in our society. But it doesn't mean that different groups of people and different communities around the world, they don't have their own rhetorical traditions and writing conventions as well. All right. So here in this kind of work, we are talking about Englishes as operationalized in the context of differing rhetorical conventions and different rhetorical, articulations in writing as well as speaking, for example. And the role here, for example, at this, the Yamuna Kachru in World English is to look at cultural differences in rhetorical styles. So, we may see differences in styles, but these are styles have very much are very much um, related to cultural differences as well. All right, across of course many varieties of English. So when we're talking here in this context, therefore, when we're talking of Englishes, we're talking of Englishes as being part of rhetorical styles that differ from one another. And I think that is something that I will expound on later on in the next few slides as well, because I would like to put forward the idea that rhetorical traditions and different writing styles, that's where we can also see different Englishes being operationalized as well. So I go back to my earlier point about when we're talking about world Englishes, we're talking about different Englishes as something that's alive and kicking. We don't talk of them as decontextualized phenomena. All right. We talk about them in terms of where they are mobilized, how they are mobilized in certain context of use, and in this context, of course, the differing rhetorical styles in conversations as well as writing. Um, Next, please. So I move on. Okay, I'll just, this is something that's very personal and just simply, very, very personal to me, because this has got something to do with some kind of work that I've done before that have taken on in my own research later on as well. So I might say that this is something crude, basic, but I'd like just simply to do this as to just to put forward this whole idea that when we're talking about Englishes, we're talking about them again in the context of certain ways of doing things in communication. So next, please, Jean. So it's pretty much straightforward. You know how it is in CLC, right? I mean, I'm not sure about now, but several years ago, we would always be talking about, you need to research on your own practice. So all of us did research in our own practice, and one of those things that really got me thinking about my own work at CLC was basically asking this question: why do my students write the way they write? All right. This is in the context of teaching professional communication, um, because for a whole 10 years, although I was assigned to do other things, I from the Young Shota Conservatory of Music, you know I I coordinated some of the English language courses there. So School of Design and Environment, also the College of Engineering, also in Arts and Social Sciences. But for the whole 10 years, I was you know, um, I was always teaching and then later on coordinating the language professional courses at the NUS Business School. So this is the context here, is the teaching of business writing, professional communication there. right? And my my practical issue really is that the students who of course we know are really highly competent students, right, would always write something that's different from how we actually ask them to write, right? Or in a sense, how the textbook, business writing textbook, professional communication textbooks would ask them to write business letters, for example, or letters that say no, that kind of thing. All right. So I was curious about basically this whole problem of in a sense, there's this challenge then of finding out. So why do they write the way they write? So I engaged in some sort of like, research, which again is what I said. From here on, I did a little bit more contrastive work or research later on. But this was actually the beginning of my interest in contrastive rhetoric, a very practical question about, you know, um, why they write the way they write. Okay. And so next, please. Yeah. So I went back, of course, to traditions of research on contrastive rhetoric. And of course, for those of you who are familiar with contrastive rhetoric, then we go back to Kaplan's 1996 rhetorical structures. Of course, this is something that has already been even instead of questioned and overturned by so many scholars of contrastive rhetoric years later. But I think it jump started, you know, the work in this particular area because of how Kaplan actually, in a sense, rhetorically represented or visually represented the rhetorical differences in the way the English language students in the United States who are supposed to be quote unquote non-native speakers of English, and without necessarily getting into the specifics, he did quite a lot of explanation of the difference between the English and the Oriental, quote unquote. He labeled them as Oriental, of course. Um, Basically saying, I think we are very familiar with this, that if those who actually write in more straightforward ways, these are the ones whose first language is English. These are the ones who, in a sense, grew up as so-called native speakers of English, right? As opposed to those who were students, international students, who moved to the United States to study, and his representation would be this like, it doesn't just simply end. It starts somewhere, it goes around and around and around. So I guess this is where what probably some people might refer to as beating around the bush. So that's how he actually started off. I mean, that's how he captured, these different rhetorical, different traditions in writing. Next, please. And so from then on, I of course moved to some different, research, and actually, I actually went into different textbooks. I surveyed different textbooks used, in NUS at the time, used in the region at the time, but also looked at, some work, some research that has been done. And this is by Connor, actually, also one of those who took up from Kaplan, the work of contrastive rhetoric. And basically, as you can see here, he looked more specifically on moves in letters of application. So you can see here, you know, she represented it as, you start by applying for a position, maybe then you explain the qualifications, expressing the desire for interview, um, explain how to be reached, and express pleasantries, right? But for Asian writings of moves and letters of application, um, it says there that there's usually a part where the letter asks for pity and express apology for taking time to read my paper or my letter and so on and so forth. So I guess we may of course question the typical representations of these, but I guess the point of the whole research really is to get us to think about um, writings that really don't subscribe to just one particular idealized understanding of how good writing should be. Next, please. And in many, as what I said, in a lot of textbooks that we were using at the time, and I think even probably now, all right. When you talk about moves and bad news messages, you talk about basically very straightforward. You begin with a buffer, all right. Then you follow with reasons, state the bad news, and then end with a positive close. So it's pretty straightforward, really, right? Um, but then, what I did basically was to, in a sense, look at the moods in my students' writing. All right. So what I said, it's kind of crude, um, but kind of simplistic perhaps. But at that time, I think it helped me really gain an understanding of a little bit deeper understanding of the students' writing, right? So I just simply put together, I think about um, 40 of those papers of business letters, um, talking about, because in the professional communication course that we taught at the time, there's always a test on a lesson on how to say no, or basically saying bad news. Um, and so in putting together all the moves, putting together all the capturing, describing basically the kinds of moves, um, we see here, at least I saw some cultural dependent written rhetorical strategies of face saving and politeness, for example. So you can see here, they begin with extended buffer. I'm going to say extended buffer is it's not a very straightforward kind of buffer, really. Extended because buffer. In fact, it's like the buffer usually cuts across the entire letter. All right, and then you follow with reasons, then you buffer again your reasons, you state the bad news, and then you buffer the bad news again. That's what is I meant by an extended buffer for the whole thing, right? Um, so in a sense, if I have to extract you know to extract some of the general moves from there. It's one would be to express, understanding, and then the appeal for understanding, and then they also apologize for the bad news. So there's a lot more going on, I think, in many of my students' writing, and I guess you can add on or probably give a summary or reasons as to why, but a lot's going on why these things are going on. So you can talk about historical socialization, for example. At some point, um, you know, um, socialization meaning that students are introduced to a new, in a sense, tradition of rhetorical writing or rhetorical way of dealing with say a bad news, for example, but it's not perfect. You don't come from one and then you move to another and that's it, right? So socialization is a kind of a process, and so when they are in process, you know they're processing what's going on, then all of these different ways of writing, ways of thinking, the cultural norms in writing come together basically in your own writing, and for that matter also communication. Of course, here we talk about hybrid forms of writing, so we can't really have one pure or purified form of writing. There's always hybridity in the way we write, depending perhaps on where we come from culturally as well, and even in our own social education, social class and education. I did ask students, however, about their own work, and I think one thing that comes up is the role of face in writing cultures. It's so difficult to just be straightforward, for example, and very very direct. And they keep on saying that it would sound very very impolite um, to just simply say, even if in one sentence you apologize for the bad news, for example. So there is a tendency or a struggle to extend it precisely because of this whole idea of face, social face in writing cultures. Um, let's move to the next piece, please. So this is my own, of course, more visualized representation of the my answer to the question, why do the students, um, why do my students write the way they write, right? So I talk about the more multiplicity of rhetoric, right? There are so many factors that come into the picture. I don't have the time to explain each of these, of course, but I identified in the paper. I hope, June, you will be able to access that paper, because I don't have a PDF file of that at the moment. Like for example, the globalizing and localizing business ethos, for example, are coming into the picture in your own, writing classrooms, local cultures as well as philosophies, as what I said earlier. You get to ask students; they have their own reasons. So in a sense, if you get to let them reflect on it, it becomes you know clear to you why there are certain cultural you know um, cultural differences that actually come together in communication. You also have state policies on education and student achievement, all right, literacy work and rhetorical traditions, even the mediation of media and technology come into the picture, all right. Um, I mean, I would even say probably even in some of the writings, religious and gender practices, and of course the more structural linguistic transformations come into the picture. I guess these are some of those factors that may help explain why the students write the way they write, and why, in the context, for example, of a specific letter, all right, a specific letter that says no or that turns down a request, that turns down an application, all right. There are different rhetorical traditions that actually emerge from that, right? And the reason why I I I share this is precisely because um, rhetorical differences are constitutive of Englishes as well, because these are all articulated, these are all expressed in Englishes, all right. And so when we're talking perhaps of so a lot when a lot of people are talking about debating on the difference between cope up with and cope with and result in and result to, I mean, we are missing so much about different, word Englishes, because it's actually far more than just simply these supposed iconic idioms that, you know, um, that represent supposedly wrongly, all right, what we mean by English as well. Next, please. And so how okay, so how do we make sense of this? All right, so I think it's important to then step back a little bit more. This is where probably I spend a bit more time, much more time than the first two parts. When you talk about stories of Englishes, of course, we're talking about like paradigms and ways of um, you know, in a sense, capturing, this phenomenon. And if for those of you who are, of course, familiar with the social linguistics of English is, and probably in some of the related fields, I think it's very difficult to ignore the work of Gattu's concentric circles, which emerged from the 1980s onwards. A lot has been done. A lot has been done to critique it, but I think we can begin with his concentric circles as because as in terms of capturing the story of some of the stories of English is precisely because it's it it's in a sense one of those early political models in the study of English. So I think his point basically is that he uses the trajectory of the how the spread of English come from has emerged from colonization and imperialism. That the English language, for example, all right, emerged from the inner circle countries, all right, and because of colonization, these have been spread across the outer circles. So when we talk about the outer circle countries, so these are countries that were erstwhile or formerly colonized by the United States and the UK, for example, um, and um, and that uh, English at even up to now, all right, does have a great deal of space in people's everyday lives. All right. In the Philippines, for example, English remains, symbolically the most powerful language, for example, and this remains in many different parts of the world. I guess even in definitely even in Singapore, in Malaysia, and other post-colonial countries as well. However, because of globalization, all right, it expanded as well, all right, into more of those, expanding circle countries such as China, which didn't have, let's say, Japan and other countries which actually didn't have, formal um, experiences of colonization, but precisely because of the extension of colonialism through globalization, it actually, now has, now is also engaged in this sort of conversations concerning the English language. So when we're talking about, in other words, I mean, a very, um, how do you call this? A very crude, or simple understanding of a story of English. So we think of it this way visually, all right? Colonialism and globalization come together in order to mobilize the English language and spread it across the world, all right? Now, in Kachru's, all right, thanks, Jean, for that. In Kachru's story of Englishes, concentric circles, all right, um, there is a strong um, focal discussion of culture that mediates the spread of the English language. All right. Interestingly, however, even in discussions, I mean, in popular discussions, and I guess even in pedagogical discussions, the the phenomenon of cultural mediation is sometimes glossed over. All right. Oh, we argue about English, as a global language. English is an international language, and therefore we should teach it, and therefore we should make it as a medium of instruction, and so on and so forth. And then go on to talk about, how frustrating it is that English has somehow changed, and therefore a lot of corrupted use of the English language has already, also spread, and so on and so forth. To me, I think it misses the entire explanation, um, or take on the spread of English doesn't actually surface the role of cultural mediation, right? Because it's what is very strong in, let's say, for example, in Katruvian paradigm and in social linguistic understanding of English is that culture has accompanied, right, the spread of English. Cultural mediation has accompanied, and precisely because of that, right, um, the spread of English did not just simply spread, all right, it has also localized, it has also indigenized. Next, please, Jean. So and then next one, please. So then, yes. So we don't just simply talk about colonialism and globalization as responsible for the spreads of the English language. Okay, we are talking about the spread and pluralization of English. All right. I think when you talk about the spread of English, it goes hand in hand with pluralization. It's never going to be just simply to spread. So when we actually think of it in terms of spread and pluralization, then precisely because of the role of culture, all right, in that spread, then we get to see the different Englishes as something that's really emerging from language contact phenomena. That these different Englishes emerge from, everyday interactions of people. We talk about how important English is because it has spread across the world, because it is a global language, because it's an international language. Then we need to recognize and acknowledge as well the role of culture in that spread. And because of that, pluralization has emerged. So pluralization is not something that um, corrupted. you know Pluralization doesn't result in corruption of English. It basically means that English has somehow diversified, precisely because people from different parts of the world who have their own different cultures have now intervened to transform and change English in their own ways. All right. So when we're talking about colonization and globalization as, mobilizing the spread of English, it always should be the twin phenomena of spread and pluralization. All right, thanks, Gene. Now, um, it's not enough, however, to just simply talk about cultural mediation. And I think that's the point of latter scholars, including myself as well. All right, because in the process of the spread, as the English language has also spread across all parts of the world, right? Not just culture, but social and political mediation as well. That's why in local context of use of English, social class, for example, also comes to the picture. Yes, English is pluralized, all right? But who still has access to that pluralized English that is still privileged in local context, all right? And in the context, let's say, I can speak very confidently, and I think Gene, of course, from the point of view of the Philippines, that yeah, when you look at it through the lens of world Englishes, you talk about English in the Philippines as Philippine English. But if you look at it through the lens of, let's say, social class and regional affiliations in the Philippines, you will find different Philippine Englishes. All right. And so in other words, that in the context of language use, English language use, there are certain mediations that occurred other just simply the quote unquote culture. All right, social class, of course, we can always argue that that's also cultural in nature, educational background, ethnicities, even gender as well, and intergenerational differences. All of these have an impact on how the English language has also changed in different ways. At the same time, the spread also has, you know, um, been mediated by different sorts of ideologies. Next, please, Jean. And some of these ideologies, of course, won't be able to talk in detail here, are, of course, the neoliberal ideologies. You talk about colonialism and globalization. So you talk about ideologies, basically values and ideas that globalization or capitalist globalization privileges, for example. So here are neoliberal ideas and ideologies about the importance of the individual, for example. All right. So in the process of doing that, then the individual as the responsible person in one's learning of English, for example. So the state, the government, society are given less work, are given less importance, or are divested of responsibility. It is you who must improve and invest in your own learning, for example, and so on and so forth. Um, and because of that, there's this whole idea of becoming flexible workers, becoming you know um, you know uh, workers who are employable, for example. And so companies then bring in, and together with it, for example, in the context of the call center industries, for example, bring in all of these sorts of ideologies that privilege certain forms of English, certain kinds of English, the status native speakerist ideologies as well. In other words, all right, and this is where my own work also comes in. um, I think to be able to have a complete picture of the stories, or what stories of English, all right, we need to look at how colonialism and globalization have not only mobilized spread and pluralization of English, but have actually produced unequal Englishes as well. All right. So we are not just simply talking about the distribution of different Englishes. We're just talking about different Englishes, as some highly valued than others, some more equal than others. In other words, precisely because of these practices and ideologies that are associated with certain characters of speakers as well as their use. Yes, next please, Jean. Now, um, you can actually then therefore talk about moving forward with some of these different models. You can just put them all there, Gene, because okay, that's it. One more, I guess another. Yes, that's right. These are, in other words, while that the earlier slides give us like some kind of like a sketch of that, of how the English language has actually spread and pluralized and been localized across the world. There are certain, of course, different conceptual differences as well among scholars. Of course, we talk about global English at the start. So global English has now been, demolished as something problematic. It doesn't really exist if you come to think of it. It's a construct, in other words, but because of globalization and colonialism. And one concept has been put forward, and this concept of world English, the idea being that yes, English still remains English, except that it has somehow, in a sense, internally also diversified. So it has opened up to lexical innovations. It has opened up to, in a sense, new words coming into the English language, probably even new structures because of language contact. But English remains English, right? English remains one, in other words, but it's just that it has that diversified on its own. Of course, Katsu now says, no, that's not it, because English has now become Englishes. All right, that different varieties on their own can stand on their own. English as an international language takes on from world Englishes, of course, but here, like Sandra McKay and others, are more focused on the role of culture in English. In other words, as English as an international language is viewed as, a language where culture is at the center, all right, of use of the language. So, who you are cannot be separated from what or how you use the English language, in other words. And that's why language and culture in this particular paradigm are always together, especially in teaching. A lot of people are saying, of course, that in the English as a lingua franca, it's is far supposedly more sophisticated, in the sense that in toward Englishes, the focus is on national Englishes, all right? But for English as a lingua franca, the focus is on like two people coming from different parts of the world who speak different languages, but they talk to one another using one lingua franca, which is English. And that English is that is used by people coming from different cultures, has actually been, transformed, reconfigured in different ways in the international global scene as well. The works of Heath Rose, for example, and others in global Englishes. This is a more recent take on these, basically put together all the kinds of Englishes. So world Englishes and the English lingua franca, all of these are basically Englishes. All right. So there are, sometimes when I'm in the Philippines, I use it to somehow signal my being Filipino as well, or basically using it as some kind like a local English kind. But when I'm outside, I talk to other people. Somehow my English might also change a bit, precisely because I'm already talking to others, all right, other than Filipinos. Now, translingual English is, of course, takes on from a much broader translingual paradigm. The idea being that you are never going to have only Englishes at all. So in real life, in real everyday practice, Englishes are always embedded in other multilingual repertoires as well. All right. So when you are talking about English, on the streets, for example, it's never just English. It's all of these, you know, um, it's you talk more about communicative repertoires rather than languages. And of course, the one that I'm really more oriented towards is unequal Englishes. So my point being again that we cannot just simply be talking about different Englishes. We're talking about unequal Englishes because some are more privileged than others. And I think that's something that we need to acknowledge and recognize, especially in the context of education. So what happens here, if I have to be straightforward about it, it's not actually, I mean, in global English has led to unequal Englishes. And global English actually is a construct. It doesn't really exist. For it to exist, for you to have an evidence that it exists, it has to be, manifested and operationalized on the ground. It's people using, English to one another in the context of unequal Englishes, in the context of different Englishes. That is what makes English global, right? So there's no way you can say something is global when you don't see it localized. There's nothing, it's social linguistically saying that there's nothing that we can't say something is global or English is global if it doesn't get indigenized. because that's exactly how, it has become global. All right, that it has spread and it has indigenized, it has localized. All right, thank you. So what are some of those ways forward? As what I said, in this particular part, in this particular aspect, I talked about some theoretical, but at the same time also practical considerations as well as we move forward and think about these different Englishes and the reality of unequal Englishes in the education system, in the educational sector. Okay, first, I talk about translingual, um, not monolingual disposition. Next, please, Jean. Horner et al. Basically talk about translingual disposition as a general openness toward language and language differences. And I think whatever it is, how we want to actually deal with different Englishes in more practical ways, I think a translingual disposition has to, you know, uh, you know, has to be honed in practice as well, so because I think a lot of teaching and learning is usually grounded in this whole idea of monolingual disposition, right? Even language teaching methodologies have, in through decades have actually been embedded in this kind of monolingual disposition. But I think that's what I said. I think we need to work towards a more translingual disposition. And here we're talking about a more general embraciveness, openness toward language and language differences. Why? Because whether we like it or not, language differences are there. All right. I think that's what social linguistics contributes to this whole idea of English is that there's nothing corrupted and there's nothing wrong with this the spread and the localization of this English is precisely because when there's language contact, there's definitely going to be localization and diversification. And so I think it's important to begin with some kind of like a translingual disposition in our teaching, even in teacher education, especially, because as what I will explain later on, it will have implications for the way we work with and we deal with our students as well. All right. Other than that, I think we have to talk about diversity as resource, right? I think in educational policy and in social policy in general, diversity has been formed and constructed as a problem. All right, it's something that that's why there's always this talk about diversity management. We need to manage diversity because it's something that's supposed to be you know, uh, problematic. Diversity is something that needs to be solved. In other words, but I think it's important that probably through the lens, of course, of translingual disposition, we can start talking of diversity in general, and of course, linguistic diversity as a resource as well. All right. So here, Terry and Irving say that attitudes related to power, privilege, and status can make it challenging for some educators to value diversity among their students, as some of them are often labeled as at risk, disadvantaged, poor, or underprivileged. Historically, these labels and the perspective associated with them have been referred to as the deficit model. All right. So the deficit model of education is basically to look at some of these some students as lacking in something, all right? When in fact, if you actually look at them through a different lens, they simply coming from different cultural traditions or practices or learning traditions for that matter, right? And perhaps we can start from there. So instead of focusing on what students cannot do, all right, this also from Irving and Terry Irving, teachers are encouraged to understand more about their students' strengths and abilities. So instead of looking for what they cannot do, what can they do? I think it's what are the things that they have? What do they have at the moment, and how can we exploit them and use them and start from there, right? In our own teaching and learning as well. Next, please. And therefore, I move on to additive pedagogy rather than subtractive pedagogy. All right. I think it's important that when we are talking about different Englishes, especially when we teach, let's say, standard English to a student, standard English, so-called standard English to a group of students who probably have not had, a great amount of access to standard English, it has to be viewed as additive pedagogy. We are adding on the standard to the repertoire of the students, not subtracting what they already have and moving that away from them in order to be replaced by what we want them to do or what we want them to have. So in subtractive models of education, students may sense that their own language and culture are not valued, precisely because the purpose of teaching is to take that language away from them, to take that variety away from them in order to replace it with something that we think is more privileged. All right. But in an additive model of education, all children are expected to maintain their native language and culture. All right. So here it's to build on. And I think Wheeler would also say this in another research, to build on and add on, to students' existing knowledge as we add another variety or standard English to their linguistic toolbox. And a little bit uh, you know, practical here is like what more focus on noticing and contrastive analysis rather than error analysis. All right. Wheeler here says in contrastive analysis, the practitioner contrasts the grammatical structure of one variety with the grammatical structure of another variety, presumably the standard, in order to add the standard dialect to the student's linguistic toolbox. And indeed, the research is robustly clear. Teaching methods which do take vernacular dialects into account in teaching and the standard work better than those which do not. All right. I think if I go back to my own example earlier, my own research example earlier, I think one way to do contrastive work is basically to get the students to see their own work against, for example, that of, the textbook model and so on and so forth, or what, other pieces of good writing are about, and get them to reflect more on this. And that's why it's the word here, the operative word is noticing, which is, of course, a very much common term in second language acquisition, and of course also language teaching pedagogy, where we get the students to notice differences. We get the student to notice, similarities and differences, because in what the research has shown is that if students are able to articulate on their own why how their language differs from what they're learning, or how their variety of, let's say, English differs from the variety of English that's being taught, if they're able to explain it and explicitly and more consciously, more learning has happened. More learning is it actually happens as well. All right. So instead of just simply pointing out the errors, there could be that, in the context of a more additive pedagogy, some of these structural, some could be structurally dependent. In other words, why certain compositions are written in particular ways, precisely because there are structural and functional and semantic, differences that get into the writing of the students, and to be able to get them to understand, and hopefully make such changes in the context of, what you're teaching them, then contrastive analysis might work in this context. Right, next. And lastly, therefore, I say multi-competent, not native speaker, focus, meaning I think it's a lot of um, work has been invested in working towards native speaker norms, for example. Um, Interestingly and ironically, it's an ideal. So I just look at, in one of my very recent research on funding, funded research projects, English language teaching projects in the Philippines, especially in Mindanao, in the south of the Philippines. Um, the funded research projects are attached to or require the use of certain computer generated assessment, and teaching materials, for example. And the highest is always five. The highest is five, in other words, native or near native, and so on. But if you look at all the scores, they never make it, precisely because native the native speaker ideal is something that's, supposedly either you have it or you don't. All right. And so no matter how much you actually work towards it, it's never going to happen for certain groups of people, and so on and so forth. Plus, of course, what the research has shown, all right, really, like for Cato here and Rosenham and Han and Galloway basically also talk about this. What the research has shown is that when you talk about competent communication, it has nothing to do with the native speaker, whether or not, um, I think we need to talk about, the conversation has to talk about what counts as, you know, effective and competent use of the English language, for example. And this is something in a sense very basic, but I think something that we have been engaged in and been struggling with. I know for the past many years, even back in CLC, we have been asking these questions as well. All right. But I think this is something that we need to put forward. How do we, what is the end goal of, let's say, our teaching? All right. And here, of course, when you talk about, you know, competent speaker, it's used as Cato says, it's seen as a unique user and a person in their own right, free from descriptors of such as failed native speaker. All right. And Rosenham and Galloway basically say someone who makes strategic choices about language use. And I think to focus on how do we help them make strategic choices in order to become effective language users as well. All right. Next, please. So in conclusion, I just would like to share this in my last slide. I in a recent, not quite recent, but 2016 paper of mine, the possibilities of an adaptive, embracive pedagogy, and um, I put together, I reviewed the literature. All right, not of course, and on all levels of education on the study of Englishes as well, and the study of multilingualism more in general as well. And what I found is that such research have somehow given us three understandings of three possibilities of what an embracive adaptive pedagogy might look like for everyone, because what it can accomplish. The first one is attitudinal change. Right? I think by getting our students to look at, let's say, for example, doing some contrastive rhetoric, and basically getting them to experience and affirming their own kinds of languages and ways of doing things and in the culture in the classroom. I think, not in a sense, not just the students, but also the teachers themselves also experience a change in attitudes towards some of these non-privileged varieties of the language that we actually engage with or struggle with in the class as well. And if we actually do these things, there is some kind of attitudinal change. Another thing, of course, is facilitative learning. In other words, it's interesting how the use of these, or the incorporation of these non-standard or non-privileged varieties, for example, in the classroom, is used in a very negative ways. But if they're used actually, for example, in the context of contrastive analysis, how they can be used to structurally, differentiate between, different kinds of writing, different ways of using. All right, actually, it facilitates the learning of what it is that we want them to teach. So if you're talking about the standard language or the standard English, knowing fully well, for example, that this is somehow still a contested term. But if this is what we want to work towards, it can actually facilitate the learning of it. All right. Um, but it is a more embracive pedagogy because you are adding on, not subtracting. And lastly, of course, here we're talking about cultural affirmation. It's a culturally affirming pedagogy. It's something that affirms who our students are, rather than just simply take them all away from them and hope to replace them with what we want them to learn. All right. So that's, I think, of hope, and I'm looking forward to a dialogue with everybody. All right. So thank you very much for attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tupas. We are now open for questions and comments from the audience. So you may unmute yourself and introduce yourself, and then express your question. Yes, please give Dr. Tupas a round of applause for that very provocative and very enlightening, enriching talk. Anybody would like to ask questions or comments, give comments, or build on the ideas, or perhaps disagree? Yes, Letitia.
It's fascinating. Thank you very much. I'm just jumping in. I'm sorry because I'll have to leave after I have a class, but I have two questions and you can decide which one you want to answer. Or the first one is, you focus quite a lot on I don't know if I'm using the right terms, but Englishes that are of the native kind. So people who have different variation of English, but who have learned those different varieties from young. And I completely understand how these would be legitimized. Is there a way to build a legitimacy of non-native varieties, like myself? Like I'm a French citizen. I'm not sure how my English can be legitimized as, you know, something to be, you know, this beyond just showing ability to learn a language. It's not a culture. I can't turn back to French people and we don't share an English together. That is, you see what I mean? That's my first question. And the second question is, what do you think reproduces native speakerism? I've been in this field for decades and it's constantly coming back. So is it political, economic, is it epistemic? I worry about this because I find it's very it's a disruption. It's you know, native speakers shouldn't be paying much effort into justifying their you know, their validity and so on. Okay, these are my two questions.
All right, thank you very much. I think I'll start with the second question first on native speakerism. I think the one thing that I usually, I mean, I've engaged in a lot of teacher training, you know, in different parts of the world, and one of the things that I'm usually accused of is like I hate native speakers, which is not the case. You know, that's why I keep on saying we are talking about native speakerism. All right. Native speakerism is an ideology, is a way of looking at, for example, the construct of the native speaker as something that is supposed to be the given authority in everything that has got to do with teaching and learning. All right. And this is not, I mean, you know, let's say, for example, Filipino teachers, for example, also can exhibit and demonstrate native speakerist practices as well. So it cuts across, you know, different kinds of people as well. All right. And so it's about ideas. It's about what sort of values get perpetuated in our teaching and learning as well. All right. And part of the whole discourse on native speakerism is this whole idea that the native speaker actually, that we all know what exactly is a native speaker, that we all agree. And one thing that is, I think that I usually give is basically this whole idea of course, there's a whole line of research on that this, you know, that really questions it. But it's a very recent one by a Filipino scholar based in Korea who actually engaged in some kind of a research of, you know, attitudes towards you know, different sort of Englishes, right? What she did was to get some students to respond to or comment on the English that comes out of robots, all right? That comes out of robots, and, you know, ask them to rate the, you know, the robots and the English that's associated with it, all right? But and somehow the results that came out there are such that, you know, the robots, the English of the robots actually were rated very, very highly by the students themselves, all right, because it's supposed to be really non-native and so on and so forth and so on and so forth. And then what she did was to take the robot off, all right, and get them to listen to the actual speakers of the robots, and these were the Filipino teachers, all right. And then almost automatically the ratings went down, all right. um then suddenly they become they become not believable. Suddenly they become not confident, and so on and so forth. So I think my point here really is that this whole idea of the native speaker, I think, is a construct to start with. And if you unpack it, as we unpack it even more, all right, it actually means differently to different kinds of people, and you can't really separate it from, all right, how it's being embodied, by different groups of people as well. All right. Um, Going back to your first question, actually, when I put in this whole idea of unequal languages, I'm talking about not just simply the legitimized in English, really. And I am with you that the questions of legitimization are extremely difficult, and that's the reason I think we have to look at little spaces here and there, and all little classrooms and materials, for example, where we can actually get them to these different Englishes get into the materials and get them to reflect on these differences. I think that's one way to also somehow, slowly get them to legitimize, all right, different sorts of illegitimate Englishes for that matter. Another thing before I move on to the next question, whoever's going to ask the next question, is that one of the things, again, that I'm accused of, or usually that one of the fears that teachers have, is that when you actually legitimize these other Englishes, then the standard goes down. All right. But the thing is that we're talking about strategic use of this of this Englishes, and I think in the scholarly work, tradition across it, this comes back strategic, judicious use. It has to be strategic and judicious use. If it has something to do with better learning, more effective learning, then use it rather just simply, having this monolingual mindset, monolingualist mindset that everything that is not this, everything is already wrong to start with. So I think I think we need to be open more to the possibilities of this diversity to actually be, in a sense, helpful in the teaching of what it is that we want to teach.
Yeah, thank you so much. Ron. Yeah, it's really about the student agency as well to decide when each register is appropriate. But thank you so much. That was fascinating, very interesting. Thanks.
Thanks, Letitia. Thanks, Sir Tops. We have a couple of questions from the chat box.
Yeah, sorry, just to let you know, I'm on my phone, so I cannot see a lot of people, whoever, so I may not be able to address them correctly and politely. So sorry about that.
So that was Letitia, a colleague.
All right. Yeah. Yes. I can.
Yeah. So we have a question from Tanya. I'll read Tanya's question. Tanya loves your embraces pedagogy. I love it too. I wonder, this is from Tanya, what would you reply to a student learning English who says, I want to speak and write as a native speaker? I think which is an expression we get a lot from our students.
Well, yeah, I mean, I get that too. All right. Well, I probably first ask, what is a native speaker? All right. And I think I let it, I let it go that way because, again, my experience dealing with these is that it takes time to somehow digest, all of these issues that come into the picture. In fact, whether at the Institute of Education, at the National Institute of Education in Singapore, or here at the Institute of Education in UCL, I don't go straight in my first session, really. I guess you need to unpack many of these concepts first and foremost, for everybody to be able to understand. All right. Why these things matter really, because a lot of it, because you see, I guess we all know, our stances on teaching and on learning are not just simply stances of teaching and learning. They have got something to do with who we are, our identities, and so, demolishing certain problematic stances and practices are basically may have an impact on, knowing who we are as teachers and learners as well. So I guess to me, it doesn't really, to me, it's not something that I will really immediately, engage the student with. But if that student will be able to come and attend my classes, then slowly I think all this contrastive rhetorical work, all of this, asking questions as we move along, you know, um, might also be addressed. And another thing, of course, is that, at the end of the day, I'm sorry, I mean, sometimes we could be neoliberal in this sense. At the end of the day, all right, parents want results, right? And I think Dr. Luke Lu is in the house. I think his work on additive pedagogy in Singapore, very recent one. All right, I think something that we all can refer to. Um, but I think one of the things. I mean, when I was in Singapore, so many of my projects were in the context of education, and you know the mere mention of Singlish, for example, uh, will definitely it's a red flag basically. But at the end of the day, when they see the teachers, I mean, the teachers and the parents actually see the results, of how your kinds of pedagogy have sort of produced better better writing and better use of English, for example, the things become a little bit clearer for them as well. All right. I don't know if we have time, but yeah, probably one of the students I had back in Singapore, started crying when I was talking about these things basically, and then she narrated a story of how she became, this I think in the local school, that she became the toast of the town in the school because she was able to somehow move the students' scores really high, for a year for these supposed disadvantaged students, right? And she knew deep in her heart that she was using and deploying the cultural vernacular resources of the students, right, in order to explain. I think it's in the context of writing, and so on and so on. But when she was asked, but she was asked to talk in front of everybody, because she became the outstanding teacher, she never talked about this use of vernacular resources. She just simply told them, oh, I think you need to be a committee teacher. You just need to to work hard as a teacher. And she started crying because she said, because you know um I was keeping the whole truth from everybody because I was afraid that I would be vilified for using that. But so I guess the point here is, like, slowly I think we can get ourselves to talk about these things, if we actually not only see the value of it, but actually the results of it.
Um, I think Luke is here, but he says he's on baby duty now. So I'm just going to read his question. Here is his question. How could we reconcile the acceptance of Englishes in social linguistics as a field with the institutionalization of unequal Englishes in the very higher education sites you work in? Example, do systems like TOEFL and IELTS as gatekeepers for admissions processes perpetuate the illegitimacy of particular Englishes?
Oh yeah, definitely. I think we're talking about. I think this is also about in reference to Letitia's question earlier. We're talking about legitimization. I think legitimization is never just simply an individual matter, but at the same time also an individual thing. We talk about conditions, we talk about systems, but at the same time, perhaps we talk about agency among ourselves, or in ourselves as well. So going back to that question, I think it's difficult in terms of policy, but I mean collectively we can. I think as for example, as an institution, as a department, as a center, I think we can come together and you know you know start off conversations, if we haven't started yet, conversations about exactly what kinds of you know um, what goals in language teaching and learning, for example, do we really actually have, and do we actually, I think it's about time to probably come to comment face to face with the reality. Do we actually still subscribe to native speakerist practices in our own institutions, in our own center, for example? I think we need to surface that as a collectively as a center. All right. And if not, how do we work towards it? How do we have this what we might call this additive embracing pedagogy, for example, and what sort of pedagogical practices might arise out of it. I think that's how we can actually move forward. Um, we can my colleague, for example, one of my colleagues, for example, Talia Isaacs, who is in very much in language assessment, has devised descriptors that basically are explicitly saying that we are not working towards native speaker norms, but basically towards um, you know identification of or aspects of effective communication, for example. Now, in terms of practices, for example, I think one way, and I'm sure CLC has done this, and we have been doing that for many years, for decades already. Actually, the center, how we probably can just sit down and bring together samples of good writing that good writing, that excellent writing that probably represent diversities in writing traditions, and from there write off the descriptors, right? So if these all different kinds of writing are all excellent kinds of writing, right? How do we articulate them as descriptors in such a way that the descriptors therefore capture a lot broader dimensions of writing, for example, rather than simply get it from somewhere, right? And then use these descriptors and impose them on the writing of our students.
There's an interesting discussion in the thread. Mark, would you want to express your comments and questions?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Ruani, so much for the talk. It's bringing up so many important issues, I think. I just wanted to share my experience in Hong Kong when I was at the British Council there for 4 years. The Cambridge Suite exams for young learners. These kids, they start very early on, learning native speakerism, basically. So from the ages of like 6 or 7, you've got these little kids coming in and doing exams, for the young learners, and these are viewed as valuable in schools as a measure of English language levels. And so I think that, it's very deep rooted in places like, post-colonial nations. And so, I just wonder to what extent we can make a change, because very early on they start doing these exams. And then after that, of course, you get Cambridge Suite for adults. You also get IELTS as an entrance exam. All of the time, learners are seeing these benchmarks that I think are basically, a representative of native speakerism. I think the ideology is quite strongly embedded in our field. And my question is, to what extent do you think we can make a change as agents?
All right. It's excellent, definitely excellent question. Something, of course, again, would be very difficult to do to engage in, because language assessment, international language assessments are an industry. It's a money-making industry, right? And I think Casey is here. One of those reasons why we actually started off, project in the Philippines and Indonesia and Vietnam. Well, basically the idea that the textbooks being used are textbooks that have been imposed upon the local communities as well. Well, I guess little things that can be done. I think institutions. I mean, that's what I said, because these are broad. I mean, these are huge, global industries. Then it's extremely difficult to work against them, basically. But for institutions that have spaces for transformation, I think it's important. That's what I said, to go down and sit together and think about reconceptualizing understandings, for example, of what is English to start with. If we are talking about English as an international language, therefore. So what constitutes that kind of English and how should we move forward, right? And I'm glad that, again, I've been away from CLC for quite some time now, but I know for a fact that even then we were not using, prescribed textbooks. We were producing our own materials as well. So I think institutions in different parts of the world can actually do that as well, starting off with building expertise from the ground, building expertise of their teachers, in order to come up and produce um, materials that actually are far more appropriate than what is being imposed on them. One of the things, of course, that we encountered then in our projects, and even in my in my latter conversations with different educators, is that some of these textbooks are also imposed, right? Some of these textbooks are required, so you can't really. So one of those things that we would always, one of the talking points with them. So what are some strategies that you can use? You use these textbooks; these are imposed. What can you do in the context of these, extremely limiting conditions, in order to allow for, a much wider variety or diversity of materials that you can use, all right? So I guess different institutions, different strokes, I think, and different strategies. But I guess if I think we need to go back as an institution, as a department, as a center, for example, and ask ourselves, what is it that we can do, all right? So again, it's not definitely CLC, right? But in the other institutions, if they have the option, for example, to disrecognize many of these like global testing, in institutions, and probably, make it far more appropriate in their own context, then perhaps they can do it. All right, that's one way to, in a sense, write back and work back, against these global institutions.
We have one more minute, and I think we have a couple of questions more. We have a question from Dr. Jonalu Labor from the UP College of Mass Communication. What systems have been, I think this is a general question, what systems have been put in place by universities to pave the way for the embrace of world Englishes in curricula, classroom admissions?
Well, I guess if you talk about systems in general, I don't think there are systems really in general, but there are institutions. That's what I said. There are departments, institutions that are far more open to these. All right. So I guess we have to look at it in terms of local institutional responses. All right. There have actually been quite a lot of those initiatives that open up, materials and pedagogies in general, to world English's paradigm, and actually to multilingualism for that matter. To me, however, I think in my role as as a language teacher educator, I think a lot of work has to be done in the context of language teacher education, really, because it all starts from there, right? You can't have all these policies. I think we know this, in terms of multilingual, mother tongue multilingual language policy, for example, and other kinds of world Englishes policies. You can have all of these sophisticated policies, but if teachers are not ideologically prepared and open, you will still struggle with these kinds of policies. So I think we need to start with language teacher education as well, and teacher training for that matter. A lot of it has got to do with that, because then if teachers and policy, educational policy makers themselves, all right, are open to these possibilities. I can give you one that I have been working on. For example, one institution in the Philippines, from the very start up to now, I've been engaged from broad, workshops up to how now they are doing research on transforming their own curricula, right? Changing their own curricula based on what they have research on as well. But why did they get into that? Because they attended, conversations, and they came up with conversations. They invited many of us as well. So I guess there are possibilities, but it's a long drawn process. Really, to me, as what I said, whether you are talking about your own class or talking about language teacher education workshops, it has to be a long drawn kinds of conversation. You can't have a 1 hour, 2 hour conversation to change people's minds. Of course, now we know that many of us here already are coming in with a lot of that discussions and plays, but in many conversations, with teachers, these are very, very new to them, and you can't just simply say, you know, I have one experience of someone saying, you know, I delivered a keynote and giving empirical work on the usefulness of all these things, and then the first question is, all these things can make my students dumb, so you can't change, basically someone's, trajectory, especially identity trajectory in just an hour.
Yeah, I think that we end with that. Thank you so much for the very provocative talk, Dr. Wani Tupas, and thank you so much for all the participants. Special mention to Reese and to Roland, our former colleague who's now in University of Oxford, enriching the conversation. Thank you so much. I hope that we will consider seriously the embrace of additive pedagogy as we journey through with our students through the semester and beyond. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone. Yeah. Bye-bye.